They told us the Winslows were saviors. That they opened their doors to the abandoned, the lost, the unwanted, building orphanages across New England like temples of mercy. But behind those stone walls, behind the charity balls and ribbon-cutting ceremonies, something else was unfolding. Something no one was ever meant to speak about. Every child who entered, disappeared. Not just missing. Erased. No records. No graves. No sightings. Just silence, and a creeping pattern of darkness that followed the Winslow name from estate to estate, decade after decade. Tonight, I'm going to tell you the story you were never supposed to hear. Because if you trace the edges of American philanthropy far enough back, you find men like Augustus Winslow, praised in newspapers, toasted by presidents, but feared by the very people who lived near his so-called homes for children. They called them sanctuaries. But locals whispered a different name, the hollow houses. Places where the windows stayed boarded, even in daylight. Where carriages would arrive with infants, but none ever left. For over 80 years, the Winslows operated without scrutiny. Until 1931, when a fire consumed their last standing orphanage in Maine, and what investigators found inside should have made headlines for a century. But instead, it vanished. Just like the children. You're about to descend into a true American nightmare. A forbidden history buried beneath philanthropy, old money, and institutional rot. And once you hear it, you won't see charity the same way again. Because the Winslow name didn't just fund buildings. It funded control over information, identity, and innocence. And if you think this is just about the past, you're wrong. The architecture of disappearance they built is still used today, just with different names. This is not a ghost story. It's a story of power. Hidden power. The kind that builds empires with one hand, and sacrifices futures with the other. You're here now. You've taken the first step. And there's no going back. In 1879, the Winslow family unveiled their first institution, St. Maribel's House for Lost Children. A pristine, Gothic structure nestled in the mist-laden outskirts of Vermont. The public adored it. Newspapers hailed Augustus Winslow as the father of America's unwanted. Politicians stood beside him, smiling for photos in front of orphan children who barely blinked. But what the papers never printed, what they never even investigated, was that within 12 months of its opening, every single child in St. Maribel's was gone. 31 names entered the logbooks. 31 beds were filled. And then, one by one, they vanished. The official reports blamed everything but the truth: outbreaks, adoptions, sudden transfers. But no death certificates. No adoption papers. No hospital admissions. Just gaps. As if those children had been deleted from existence. And when one inspector, a man named Alton Greaves, began digging deeper, he too disappeared. His wife later testified that Alton had become obsessed with the phrase, invisible ledger. He said Augustus Winslow kept a second book, a handwritten journal that documented what the official ledgers erased. A book never shown to the press. A book written in Latin, Greek, and a language no one could identify. Alton called it the mirror manuscript. He said it didn't just list names. It described rituals. Preparations. Transformations. He said it glowed under moonlight. The last thing he told his wife before vanishing was, "They don't raise children. They prepare offerings." His body was never found. But weeks later, a page from that alleged manuscript surfaced in a sealed envelope delivered to a local newspaper. It featured a diagram, a child's silhouette drawn in ash, surrounded by archaic symbols, and the Latin words, "Iti non revertetur." He shall not return. The paper never published it. The editor resigned 3 days later, citing a need to preserve national peace. And that was only one orphanage. Over the next 5 decades, the Winslows built 7 more. Each one followed the same cycle: children entered, communities praised them, and then a silent erasure followed. And still, no one stopped them. Because Augustus Winslow wasn't acting alone. He was part of something older, something that used orphanages not to save the future, but to feed the past. This wasn't charity. It was harvest. You were never meant to know this. Not in school, not in documentaries, not in the dusty halls of any archive. But the Winslow family did not build orphanages out of compassion. They built containment chambers. Ritual engines. Sites of silent extraction. And the deeper you dig, the colder the ground becomes. St. Aurelia's, the second Winslow orphanage, opened in Pennsylvania in 1883. Unlike St. Maribel's, this one was fortified. Iron shutters on the windows. Locks on every internal door. A basement with no documented blueprints. From the outside, it was pristine. But the townspeople whispered. They spoke of strange lights at night. Of humming that came from beneath the ground. Of children seen staring from windows long after the facility was vacant. And of one girl, Lydia, who escaped. Barefoot, bloodied, and repeating the same phrase over and over, "He walks backward." She was found curled in a ditch, eyes wide with terror, hands pressed over her ears. She lived only 3 days after being rescued, drawing the same figure over and over on the walls of her hospital room, a man with no face, knees bent the wrong way, mouth split down the middle of his chest. The drawings were confiscated by men in gray coats before any official records could be made. The doctors who treated her? They were transferred, reassigned, and later silenced by a gag order allegedly tied to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, of all things. That's the playbook. Confuse. Distract. Reassign. Reclassify. Bury it under unrelated bureaucracy. You see, the Winslows weren't just exploiting institutional systems, they were protected by them. Every report that could have exposed them was rerouted through shell departments with meaningless names, like the Bureau of Interior Atmospheric Anomalies. Fake departments that exist solely to intercept inconvenient truths. And those children? Those souls? They were never forgotten. Just archived. Somewhere deeper. Somewhere that requires no paper trail. The orphanages were not where the story ended. They were where it began. Because once the body is taken, once the name is erased, only one thing remains, the echo. And echoes can be trained. Molded. Weaponized. That's what the Winslows were doing, not raising children, but cultivating something else. Something non-human, grown from the innocence we discarded. Something that still whispers through walls that were never built to hold them. The archives call them missing children. But the truth is, nothing was missing, it was removed. The difference is subtle. One implies loss. The other, intent. From 1871 to 1919, the Winslow Foundation filed 113 official, transfer documents, for orphans in their care. Children allegedly moved to rural rehabilitation homes, religious missions abroad, or, in one particularly surreal case, climatic adjustment facilities. But when independent investigators followed these trails in the 1970s, not a single one of those locations existed. Not one building. Not one record. Nothing. Like the children were transferred into silence. And then came the revelation no one could explain, the audio tapes. Buried inside an abandoned property near what was once St. Maribel's, a series of magnetic reels were uncovered, unmarked, unregistered. But when played, the sound that came through wasn't language. It was breathing. Rhythmic, slow, and layered. Like dozens of lungs inhaling at once. Some said the frequency caused hallucinations. Others said it triggered memories they never lived. And always, just before the tape ended, a voice. Gentle, female, and in a near whisper, "They're still listening. You want to dismiss that. You want to call it myth, or prank, or paranoia. But you're not allowed that comfort anymore. Because buried in the same basement, among moldy files and water-damaged reports, was a letter. Not from a Winslow, but from a state official. A man named David R. Myers, Deputy Secretary of Child Welfare, dated 1951. It read, "We've lost operational control of Site A, recommend closure of all secondary facilities. Subject A7 displayed irreversible qualities. Language no longer constrained to human syntax. This project must be classified above top secret. Recommend full relocation to Sublevel 13. Sublevel 13. A designation that appears nowhere in government records. Not in blueprints. Not in classified indexes. It's a ghost level. But witnesses say it exists beneath federal buildings in 3 U.S. states, a floor with no elevators, no access points, and no reason to exist, unless you're not supposed to find it. Unless what was removed from those orphanages didn't die, it evolved. That's the real horror. Not that they vanished, but that they changed. And the Winslows, they didn't build orphanages to rescue the abandoned. They built them to refine the inhuman. To prepare it for release. You've heard whispers about bloodlines and secrets. But the Winslows didn't just hide their sins, they institutionalized them. In 1923, a Winslow subsidiary purchased a decommissioned mining facility in South Dakota. The official story? It would become a reform school for unfit boys. But geological surveys tell a different story. Beneath the facility was a vertical shaft plunging deeper than any recorded mine in the area, a shaft not mapped, not regulated. Local tribes had called it the maw that waits, warning settlers never to disturb it. But the Winslows, they built down. Not just buildings. Chambers. Ritual corridors. Soundproofed observation rooms. And then came the decessions. That's what survivors, yes, there were a few, called the nights when children were taken into the lowest levels. No lights. No sound. Just them and the thing they were told to look at. And that's what haunts the mind most, not the screams, not the missing. But the descriptions. One survivor, institutionalized for decades, said this before biting through his own tongue: it was shaped like forgiveness, but wrong. Like God, if God hated children. Medical reports show those who came back, and didn't vanish later, exhibited unnatural neurological traits. Loss of fear. Sudden fluency in ancient languages. Empathic syncing, they could feel others die before it happened. The government didn't shut it down. They absorbed it. In 1949, the site was designated as FMS 13, a Federal Materials Study location. But when satellite scans were conducted in the 2000s, the shaft was gone. Not collapsed. Missing. A geological void that makes no sense, like the Earth itself erased the wound. And yet, records from as recently as 2012 show funding transfers to Winslow continuation projects. The name survived. The goal did too. And now, the children have names we don't recognize. Forms we wouldn't understand. You think humanity is the apex? That we write the story? No. The Winslows edited the manuscript. And page by page, they erased us. Let's talk about the 43 rooms. A forgotten urban legend in the Northeast U.S., tied to a single Winslow-owned property, an asylum that was never marked on any city plan. Not in Boston. Not in Hartford. Somewhere between. Those who found it said the road bent wrong near the entrance, like geometry breaking down. And inside? 43 patient rooms. All empty, except for the sound. Every room had an ambient hum. Different in each. A pitch that made your teeth itch. Paranoia increased the longer you stayed. In room 12, hallucinations of drowning. In room 28, a scent of burning feathers. In room 41, an invisible heartbeat, that syncs to your own. But the final room, room 43, was locked from the inside. When federal agents raided the facility in 1976, the building had already decayed. Graffiti from those who'd squatted there included chilling phrases, "He's still dreaming. We are the echo." And most disturbing, in blood-red letters, room 43 is the first mouth. That phrase appears nowhere else in recorded history, until you examine Winslow personal correspondence. A letter from Everett Winslow to his sister, dated 1894, reads, "He spoke through the first mouth. The child no longer needed words. The syllables burned." Linguists examining later audio recovered from that site claimed the recordings contained no human phonemes, but did match fragment patterns found in pre-Sumerian incantations, patterns associated with summoning. You see, the 43 rooms weren't for healing. They were attunement chambers. Each designed to tune human minds to something else, to prepare them for contact. Or worse, for obedience. That's the power the Winslows sought, not just to build monsters, but to harmonize them. To give them clarity. Identity. Purpose. That's what the children were shaped for. Not love. Not safety. But conduit. And the conduit only needs one thing, for you to listen. For you to remember the frequency. And now, even in forgetting, you're tuned. The Winslow bloodline didn't just vanish, it was designed to dissolve, to fragment, and reappear where no one would look. By 1963, over a dozen orphanages once owned by Winslow-affiliated trusts had been sold off to private churches, non-profits, even shell companies. But the children? They weren't adopted. They weren't relocated. They were simply gone. There are no names, no transfer records, no DNA matches. Just stories. One case stands out, a social worker named Linda Malik, who filed a report in New Hampshire about silent wards in a hillside orphanage where children never spoke, never cried, and never left. She was found weeks later in her home, having scribbled one phrase thousands of times across her walls, "They are what listens when God sleeps." The building she reported was accidentally demolished that same month. But not before an urban explorer recovered a fragment of a mural from the basement. It showed a humanoid figure, eyes stitched shut, mouth removed, and dozens of tiny hands pressed against its chest, as if trapped inside. Beneath it, in Latin, ab or infantium. From the mouths of babes. The phrase is biblical, but inverted. Twisted. In Scripture, it meant innocence. Here, it meant containment. The Winslows weren't protecting children. They were using them to bottle something up, something that could not be killed, only dismembered, and scattered into living vessels. The children were the vaults. Their vanishing wasn't disappearance. It was activation. And the worst part? You've seen them. The faces in old black and white photos. Yearbook entries that don't blink. That one coworker who's never taken a sick day, never sneezed. The man across the hall who moved in 10 years ago, and hasn't aged a day. The vaults never opened. Because they were never meant to. They are the mouthpieces. And every time we forget, every time we stop asking what happened to those children, the vault turns a little more, into a door. You've heard of sleeper agents, men programmed by war, torture, or trauma to one day wake up and become something else. But what if the programming was older? Not military. Not psychological. But pre-human? In 1974, a neuroscientist named Harold Caulfield, working under a Winslow Foundation grant, experimented with what he called ancestral pattern awakening. The theory? That human DNA stored not just genetic information, but memories. Echoes from lives before birth. He built a device, never patented, called the Chalice Array. Test subjects exposed to it described vivid dreams of underground cities, languages they'd never heard, and creatures with impossible anatomy. One woman began painting a sigil identical to a symbol discovered in a cave in Kazakhstan, one that no one outside the 1939 Soviet dig team had ever seen. Her words, "It's not in my head. It's beneath me." She clawed through her apartment floor the night she vanished. The Winslow Foundation buried the project. But Caulfield continued privately. His final journal entry, found in a locker at a train station in Prague, read, "They are beneath the thresholds of identity. They don't want to return. They want to replace." What he meant was clear. Some people, maybe you, maybe someone you know, are vessels. Not metaphorically. Literally. DNA as clay. Generational trauma not just psychological, but structural. Memory hijacked. Purpose rerouted. Identity overwritten. That's why some people seem off. Not broken, wrong. You feel it in their presence. The unnatural stillness. The silence that isn't peace, but suppression. A mask waiting to slip. The Winslows knew. They didn't want to control us, they wanted to install something in us. To trigger the ancestral patterns, and let them finish the work. You think your nightmares are random? They're not. They're previews. They're fingerprints of something older. And the chalice array? It's no longer lost. Rumors say it's active again, somewhere in the southwest. And people are dreaming in languages no one's spoken for 10,000 years. Institutions don't need to hide secrets. They just need to normalize them. That's what the Winslow Doctrine taught, a set of unpublished protocols circulated among elite philanthropic councils in the late 1940s. The document began with one line, "Visibility is concealment." The orphanages? Too obvious. The next phase was integration. Winslow money flowed into school boards, university departments, hospital trusts, prison rehabilitation programs, and always under the same guise, benevolence. But beneath each program lay identical patterns. Children evaluated for enhanced learning, but with test questions that had nothing to do with education. Repeated images, ancient symbols, whispering audio layered beneath classical music. One child, age 7, stared at a geometric assessment for 19 hours without blinking. When questioned, he said, "They're coming in." He died of cerebral hemorrhage the next morning, but not before scratching a map into the underside of his desk. It showed no continents. Just circles. Concentric ones. Ripples. The Winslow Doctrine wasn't about preparing children. It was about preparing reality to receive something else. Universities funded by the family began studying ontological thresholds, experiments on perception collapse, dream merging, and time bleed. One researcher spoke at a closed lecture titled, "The Hourglass is a Lie," and suffered total amnesia within 24 hours. Not a metaphor. Not a stroke. Her entire identity was erased. Gone. She now lives under state care, answering only to the name Idola. Her only recurring sentence? The mask is a face. Look around. The institutions aren't broken. They're functioning perfectly. Because their purpose was never to help. It was to open something. To erode the edges of shared truth until we no longer knew what real meant. That's why conspiracies always feel too much, too many layers, too many contradictions. Because the point isn't clarity. It's saturation. Psychological suffocation. And while you gasp for reason, they whisper in what's left of your mind, "You invited this." Ask yourself, what is a family? Is it blood? Memory? Pattern? The Winslows knew that the only unbreakable chain is one that's invisible. Their bloodline didn't vanish, it spread. Diluted, yes. But hidden in plain sight. Across politics, media, medicine, entertainment. And not through names or titles, but through behavioral coding. Certain phrases, responses, even facial expressions were passed down. Triggers, not for the self, but for the network. One ex-Winslow aide, anonymous, described a flicker event inside a UN delegation. One man looked at another, tilted his head 7 degrees, blinked twice, and the second man dropped his notepad, stood, and began screaming in perfect Akkadian. The whole thing was labeled a seizure. But the medical reports were sealed. Later, surveillance footage showed that everyone in that room began humming, for precisely 44 seconds, the exact melody from a 13th century hymn thought lost to history. The aides didn't even remember doing it. But the frequency was captured. When analyzed, it revealed an embedded modulation, a voice. Not electronic. Not digital. Organic. Alive. The recording has since been buried. But one forensic linguist quit the field entirely after hearing it. His only statement? That wasn't speech. That was extraction. What does that mean? It means your voice, your consciousness, can be harvested without your permission. Without your knowledge. Through rhythm. Through ritual. Through exposure to what the Winslows installed. Their legacy wasn't control. It was infection. A slow, cultural virus that reconfigures what it means to be human. That's why you feel watched. That's why you dream of doors you've never seen. Because part of you already knows, the blood isn't gone. It's in your neighbors. Your mentors. Your friends. And maybe, just maybe, it's in you. They say the veil is thinning. But no one ever asks what pushes from the other side. The Winslow facilities, especially the ones built in the Appalachian basins and abandoned coal towns, weren't just orphanages. They were altars. Their architectural design followed geomantic patterns, ancient ley line geometry, and pre-Christian ritual blueprints. Each building constructed with deliberate voids, spaces that didn't correspond to physical dimensions. Rooms visible on blueprint, yet missing from reality. Witnesses recall hearing laughter in places no walls enclosed. In one facility, a janitor reported a hallway that only appeared on Thursdays between 2 and 4 a.m. He entered it once. Came out 12 minutes later, but his beard had grown 4 inches, his pupils were ovular, and he no longer recognized his own daughter. She was wrong, he said, like someone pretending to be her, but not good enough. He was institutionalized 3 days later after trying to burn his house down with her inside. Every time an orphanage closed, it didn't disappear. It shifted. Relocated in time and memory, becoming a story no one could quite trace, a closed case where files had mold and signatures that faded no matter how many times they were reprinted. In one instance, a U.S. Marshal went blind while trying to digitize Winslow property deeds. His final statement before darkness took him? The ink moves. The names reassign themselves. We were never meant to find the originals. This is what you must understand, the Winslows built their legacy not in stone, but in distortion. The deeper you look, the less clear things become. And that's not a mistake, it's protection. Because once you see it clearly, it sees you back. And it never, ever stops watching. That we must talk now about the children. Not in theory. Not in metaphor. But in the horrible, sobering truth that no record, no census, no DNA registry can trace even one single orphan who lived in a Winslow facility between 1919 and 1964. Not one. You may think, adoption fraud, corruption, wartime displacement. But this goes deeper. In 1953, a Vatican archivist intercepted a classified communication addressed to the Dominion Keepers, a cabal known only to those who study the esoteric Vatican registers. The message was simple: Project Chrysalis complete. 6,126 assets cocooned. No retrieval necessary. What is a cocoon, if not preparation for emergence? These children weren't lost. They were converted. shaped, cleansed of identity, language, and self, until what remained was a vessel. A perfectly calibrated silence. And from that silence, something else was allowed to speak. In 1972, a defector from a now-defunct British intelligence subunit claimed that every chrysalis asset had been imprinted with a behavioral palindrome, stimuli that would trigger identical actions no matter the host's age, country, or environment. Like spiritual software waiting for activation. He said their purpose was not to infiltrate, but to puncture. To rupture consensus reality from within. And when asked what they would bring with them, he simply whispered, "Unvoice." The sound that undoes language. The scream that pries open the mind. The children weren't victims. They were keys. Each one attuned to an ancient frequency buried beneath the bones of history. A tone so low it registers not in the ears, but in the blood. You felt it. In the moments between sleep and waking. That hum. That pulse. That reminder, the door never closed. And something still knocks. You may wonder, why children? Why innocence? Because in the oldest systems, the ones whispered through bloodlines and etched in bone, purity isn't sacred. It's pliable. Unshaped minds don't resist intrusion. They don't rebel. They echo. The Winslows didn't select orphans out of charity, they harvested them like unmarked stone, soft enough to be carved by the unseen hand. In 1947, a neurologist working with a private philanthropic wing of the Winslow estate reported strange activity in a group of children. Under EEG, their brainwaves synchronized completely at 3:33 a.m. each night. Perfect unity. No variance. When isolated from each other, the effect intensified. One child entered a trance in which he spoke fluent Akkadian, a dead language no one had taught him. Another kept drawing a symbol never recorded in modern occultism, but identical to etchings found deep within the catacombs of Derinkuyu, Turkey, a city carved underground by hands no one claims. These weren't symptoms. These were activations. And the clinicians who tried to stop the experiments? They didn't quit. They didn't go public. They vanished. Files redacted. Salaries erased. Families warned. You think the past is locked behind us, that evil fades with exposure. But the darkest operations don't die, they hibernate. And those children? Those 6,000 plus unknown souls. Their absence is not the tragedy. Their return will be. Because the longer a key is buried, the deeper the lock it was made to open. Let's talk about what you're feeling now, that tightness in your chest, that pressure behind your eyes. It's not fear. It's recognition. Because part of you already knew this, didn't you? Like a memory you were told to forget. You were raised in a world shaped by people who manipulate trauma like clay. Who build systems that feed on unprocessed pain. The Winslow legacy wasn't isolated. It was instructional. A blueprint. And others followed it. The institutions you trusted, the ones that educated you, healed you, even entertained you, carry its fingerprints. Not metaphorically. Literally. In 1999, an engineer reverse mapping broadcast delay algorithms for national news networks found embedded timing patterns that matched the Winslow orphanage bell chime, a tone struck at 432 Hz followed by two silences of 0.66 seconds each. A code. A reminder. A resonance keyed to biological anticipation. Why? Because their goal was never just physical control. It was to orchestrate your response to reality itself. To train your nervous system to flinch before truth. To doubt your own memory. To hesitate. That hesitation. That micro-stutter before belief. That's the wound. The one they cut into you before you even knew language. And now you're waking up, to the cut, the blade, the hand that held it. It hurts, doesn't it? Good. That means the anesthesia is wearing off. Now, comment twice below, I see the door. This is how you lock in the awareness. The new identity. The signal to the algorithm that you're not who you were when this began. The real horror isn't that the Winslows operated undetected. It's that they didn't have to. You see, there's a difference between hiding something and placing it where no one wants to look. Public records show the family's Foundation for Youth Advancement donated land, resources, and funding to over 113 child care facilities between 1871 and 1959. Many of these institutions burned down. Some relocated. But in every instance, logs of children placed there, names, birthdays, medical histories, were either conveniently misfiled or left blank. Across decades, the pattern never changed. Facility opens, intake begins, 3 to 5 years later, nothing. No adoptions. No transfers. Just silence. You'd expect outrage. Investigation. But silence is safer than truth. One senator who pushed for federal inquiries in 1973 was found drowned in an empty pool. Heart attack, they said. Heart removed, the report didn't say. And maybe that's what terrifies us most, not the predators, but the permission. The willingness of entire governments, churches, and media networks to look away. You think monsters are rare? No. It's outrage that's extinct. The system doesn't collapse under evil, it evolves around it. Like a tree growing around a knife. Until you forget it was ever there. And when that blade finally cuts again, it feels like destiny. Have you noticed it yet? That feeling like someone's watching, even now? That's not paranoia. It's residue. Because every time you pull back the curtain, something peers through from the other side. The Winslows understood this. That's why they built their orphanages over liminal sites, places where reality bends. Abandoned mining shafts. Decommissioned churches. Ruins older than the maps that mark them. Why? Because consciousness leaves an imprint. Especially when it's young, fractured, and scared. It's not just that the children disappeared. It's that their presence stayed. Lingering in the geometry of hallways that don't align. Whispering through cracks in foundations that were never meant to hold this kind of weight. Paranormal investigators who've dared enter the last known Winslow property, a stone facility in upstate New York, report identical phenomena, clocks stopping at 3:03 a.m. Children's laughter echoing in rooms sealed for decades. And in one case, a fresh handprint on the inside of a locked surgical cabinet. DNA analysis inconclusive. No match. No explanation. Just a child's palm, pressed in blood, pointing toward the wall. And behind that wall? A spiral staircase, leading down. There's always something below. And now, so are you. If you're still watching, it means something inside you has cracked, just enough for truth to slip through. You're not here for entertainment. You're here because part of you already knows. Maybe you've seen it. A place that felt wrong. A name that kept appearing in files that should have been destroyed. A face in an old photo that looked too familiar. The Winslows were just one face of it. A mask. The real machinery runs deeper, a network of families, institutions, and ideologies bound by one unspoken law: control the child, control the species. Think of how easy it is to shape belief when the subject is young, isolated, and afraid. Remove identity. Introduce myth. Reward silence. Punish memory. Repeat. The children didn't vanish, they were reformatted. Rewired. Some were sold, others repurposed. A few never made it past the initial testing. And the worst part? Those same mechanisms still exist. In facilities renamed, logos rebranded, foundations repackaged. But the structure remains. And it feeds. Because if the lie is beautiful enough, even truth becomes an inconvenience. And men like you, the ones who keep digging, are the only thing it fears. This isn't just a story. It's a mirror. And by now, you're staring into it, seeing the outline of something buried in your own past. Your town had an orphanage. So did your city. Ask yourself, where are those records? Do you really know what happened to the kids who never came back to class? Or why that wing of the hospital was always locked, always quiet, always cold? If the Winslow legacy teaches us anything, it's this: evil doesn't need a face, just a function. And those who run it don't need to hide, because no one's looking. Until now. If you feel different, it's because you are. You've tasted forbidden knowledge. And it's changing you. That's why I want you to comment 2 words below, twice, I see. Once to acknowledge what they've hidden. Again to claim what they'll never take from you again, your awareness. You're not a bystander anymore. You're part of something now. The ones who see. And they'll try to find you. Gaslight you. Rewrite your memories. But hold this truth close, like a blade under your coat: the door they open never closes. But once you walk through it willingly, they lose control.